So yes, we've got a session today on sustainable infrastructure finance 101. But before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I am calling in from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, colonially known as Ottawa. As a Canadian citizen and also as an immigrant, I respect and affirm the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. I'd like to do my part to honor the commitments to self-determination and sovereignty that Canada has made to Indigenous nations and peoples. We all have a part to play to contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all share together. So please feel free to share in the chat your own land acknowledgements from wherever you're joining us from. And I'll ask Tiernan, our communications coordinator, to share a resource that we commonly use to help give context for those of you who are new to the purpose of land acknowledgements. That's nativeland.ca. So before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are running this session with a Zoom webinar, so we encourage you to use the chat, ask questions, interact with other attendees, etc. Any tech questions can be directed towards Tiernan as well in the chat. And finally, this session is being recorded and will be shared with the rest of the delegation through our private event page. So one of the major themes of 21st century life is ever-increasing urbanization. I'm sure many of you have heard that a few years ago, the global urban population passed that 50% threshold for the first time. In Canada, we continue to urbanize as well, and that means infrastructure. As somebody who is passionate about the way that we build cities, I'm really excited for this presentation today. We've got George Benson here to share his thoughts on sustainable infrastructure and finance, and to learn more about what it takes to build healthy, modern places to live, especially in light of the financial restraints that many Canadian cities currently have. So with that, we'll pass it over to George.
Thank you so much, Bo, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's my absolute pleasure to join you all, and in particular to be speaking to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, whose land I live upon and am grateful to live upon in what's known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I think I'm going to do my best to touch on some themes of reconciliation in this presentation, and I really invite all of us to be thinking about infrastructure through the lens of reconciliation, which is a complicated but in many ways integral part of the potential for reconciliation and decolonization in Canada. And I think that's a theme that I hope we can all, as I say, speak to over the course of this session. So I'm pleased to be speaking to you, as I said, from what's known as Vancouver. I'm here wearing a few different roles. I'm the sector manager for the built environment with the City of Vancouver's Economic Development Agency, the VEC. I'm also the North American lead for the Global Shapers Environment and Climate Steering Committee, which had a very, very early meeting this morning, which means that I'm lucky enough to work with climate change activists, practitioners all around the world. And then finally, I'm also the co-founder and managing director of a Vancouver-based nonprofit called the Climate Displacement Planning Initiative. And the reason I sort of give you these different titles and hats that I wear is I want to try to integrate different pieces of, on the one hand, the economic potential, the rationale for infrastructure, on the other hand, the negatives and the dangers of infrastructure, whether that's with regards to our climate or human health, safety, justice. All of these are themes that really have to be front and center when we're thinking about infrastructure. So with that, let's dive in. So this session is I struggled with this, and I was saying this to Bo as we got started here. This session is a little tricky, right? Because infrastructure is a very broad topic. Financing it is even broader in some ways. And the question of like, what does a 101 actually mean? Is it giving you the very beginning and the very end of something, or is it giving you the first 5% of a topic? Who's to say? I'm hoping that I strike a balance in this presentation of giving you just enough information, just enough context to kind of whet your appetite, and that you'll dive into Globe Capital with a lot of excitement for some of the work and topics that'll be discussed there with regards to infrastructure. So let's start with just the very basic fundamental question. What is infrastructure? Now, many of you probably think of something like this. Hydroelectric dam produces energy. It's fixed, it extends maybe outside of the immediate area where you live, and it sort of connects you to a world, but that's not that's not necessarily what everybody thinks of infrastructure. You may also think of something like this, something that underpins some of your day-to-day life, whether that's the roads or highways that you travel upon every day. You might also think of this, something that's has a fixed element, the railway tracks, the right-of-ways that are different transportation systems extend upon, but also the actual the cars, the trains, the pieces that kind of move around upon those relatively fixed elements. But it goes beyond that, right? You have these interesting sort of touch points, like a port, where infrastructure is not necessarily only the fixed elements, the cranes, the dock, the safety berms and whatnot, but maybe it's also the tugs, maybe it's the ships themselves, maybe it's the containers themselves, maybe those are part of the infrastructure of global commerce. You can take it even further still, though. So a piece of infrastructure like a hospital, downtown Toronto here, is, of course, in a fixed point, but the building in and of itself is meaningless without the staff that live within it and work to fulfill on the services that the hospital aims to provide. And I want to be clear that infrastructure is not ultimately a value neutral term, in the sense that it can be both good and bad. It is not something that is inherently positive, negative, or neutral. It is, I shouldn't say value neutral, it is value laden, rather. And that means that the things that infrastructure does, its impacts are varied, and they can be good, they can be bad. Whatever you feel about the Canadian military or militaries in general, their defense infrastructure is often part of that story. And so, how do we pay for that? How does that interact with our broader world of infrastructure are really important questions. I think we're also lucky to live in a day and age where infrastructure is not only understood in this very traditional, we often call it gray sense. We talk about green infrastructure now as well. And I'll play this out a little bit further, but the idea of a bog or a water reservoir being part of the ecological infrastructure, if you like, that underpins the world that we live in is really increasingly an important topic, and one that's recognized by a variety of different sources and builders and managers as infrastructure. But let's kind of cut to the heart of it here. I was saying to folks at the start of the call here, when I do a presentation and I'm kind of giving a lay of the land on something, I like to start with the etymology. I like to start with, what does the word we're using refer to? And the etymology of infrastructure is kind of interesting, and I think very apt, which is that borrowed from the original French, it literally means below the structure, infrastructure, below the structure. And I've put in here in square brackets of society. Infrastructure is some of the enabling elements or forces or systems or networks that in many ways underpin our society. Now, I want to be clear that that is something that extends over time, right? Infrastructure wasn't invented the day we got indoor plumbing. Infrastructure is if you like, a practice of human civilizations basically from the get-go. And we can kind of quibble about when some of the formal building of infrastructure begins and ends, but it is a long-standing practice. And I think that's important when we're talking about perceptions of the value of different types of infrastructure, which I'll click to here in a sec. It's funny, I was saying again this morning, the idea of infrastructure and its definition was just in the news yesterday. The Secretary of Transportation in the US, Pete Buttigieg, was kind of critiqued for having what might be considered a pretty broad definition of infrastructure. And this kind of tweet made me chuckle. There was a time when railroads weren't considered infrastructure, then we built them. I would probably disagree with the transportation secretary here. However, his point that the things that are considered infrastructure, which is often implied to be an essential, right? We can't live without roads. You can't live without indoor plumbing. Those definitions change over time. And all you have to do is look at telecommunications infrastructure, right? There was a time when laying a transatlantic telegraphing cable was considered frivolous, right? And then it became essential, and now it's critical. And some might even say it's existential to maintain some of those types of infrastructure. So the definition shifts and arguably grows broader and broader as time goes on. And one of the things that's important here is that there's often a kind of a binary, but I like to think of things in spectrums between so-called hard and soft infrastructure. A more sort of, or a less value-laden way of saying that maybe is physical and social, like how material is it versus how much does it play out in a broader sort of human-to-human interaction sense. And because I'm an urban planner by training, I like to think about scale. So the questions of what are the types of infrastructure, it's not only how hard or soft or how physical or how social they are, but it's also what scale of community do they serve. So if you look at the top left-hand corner here, global positioning satellites, for example, those, or GPS satellites, I guess, are profoundly physical, right? They're physical satellites that exist circling the globe, but they are serving, in many cases, I won't say every, they're serving the society at large. They are provide information to people pretty much regardless of where they live, or they can provide that information regardless of where they live. Contrast that with water reservoirs and distribution systems. Water tends to be a profoundly regional type of infrastructure because, golly gee, you can't transport water too far. We do it very far in some cases through things like levees and damming systems and so on. But in many cases, it is a little bit more regionally based. Go further down still, schools are, of course, immediately local, but they also interestingly exist in this kind of halfway point between social and physical, because you need a building to have a school. Even in the most minimal sense of like, do you have an outdoor schoolroom with a roof on top for when it rains? Infrastructure, you could say. But it, of course, is like profoundly localized. And the people within it, the teachers, are equally as important as the infrastructure. You can't have a school without teachers and a place, right? And the current Zoom age we live in notwithstanding, I think that's an interesting thing to kind of ponder. Energy generation is fascinating to me because on the one hand, you could have something very large in scope, like, for example, the global infrastructure devoted to the extraction, processing, and distribution of gases and oil and gas products. But then you could also have a single rooftop solar panel. So the spread of like society to individual is very broad. And then finally, the passport system. So there's a physicality to passports, right? Like you need a passport, you need to go through the queue, there's a border station, there's a border station, et cetera. But the impact of that is not to like produce something material in the world, it's to control and shape how people move, which is of course a very social type of infrastructure. And again, all of these are, I'm not saying any of these are good, these are just the various iterations and types of things that we can think of as infrastructure. So let's talk about finance now, which is really why we're all here, right? We all know, I think in our heart of hearts, that the most important part of infrastructure is when we cut the ribbon. Best part, right? Like politicians get all excited, they get all high on themselves. We did the thing, we're gonna build the train, yeah. And there's a symbolic power to that, right? Like you think of the election of Donald Trump in the United States, build the wall, the symbolic power of, as we all know, not even building the thing as his administration failed to do, but just saying that you're going to build something or showing that, hey, we've made the commitment, we've cut the ribbon, is a powerful exercise. But when we're talking about financing, that's probably the least important part of the entire exercise. If you need to get your electeds to cut a ribbon to pay for something, you got to do it. But the reality is that the story is much more complicated and much longer than that ribbon cutting. So this is a graph I really like that draws attention to a concept that's referred to in the infrastructure world as life cycle cost accounting or whole life cycle cost accounting, which recognizes that infrastructure has a lifespan, right? It's not just something that we build and we use and we throw away. It has an entire sort of story that can be told about it, and this story is very much one of money. So the design and the construction of infrastructure is always the largest amount of money that you spend. It's usually the most complicated thing to do, and it can often be quite time consuming. But then once you've built the infrastructure, of course, the amount of money you spend on it declines because you've done the thing. If you're really lucky, you have infrastructure that pays for itself. And so the money you make on the infrastructure goes back into maintaining it. You have this inspection and maintenance and maybe a little tweaking here and there that you do. For infrastructure that's around long enough, you may eventually decide that you want to upgrade it or refurbish it or do a major remodeling. And that's a big dip in your capital costs. And then over time, some infrastructure, not all, will decline in its effectiveness or in its value or in its sort of technical efficacy. And what you may find is that the cost of using that infrastructure goes up over time. So an interesting example of this might be the New York subway system. Some of the tunnels in that system are over a century old. The current safety infrastructure that well, you can think of sort of layers of infrastructure, right? This train system relies on a very complicated and incredibly interesting system of mechanical sensors. They're not digital. They just basically they're pressure sensors. And so when one train is running along, if the pressure sensors are tripped by this one, then this one is going to know that it has to stop and let the other one go past it. But the effectiveness of that is declining over time. So to run the infrastructure gets more and more expensive over time. And then you get to something which is often referred to as the decommissioning or demolition costs of infrastructure. You may just decide that, well, we need subways, we're just going to rebuild it. And then it becomes maybe a refurbishing cost. But if you decide, as we did in Vancouver, for example, that a hospital was no longer in the right spot, well, you say, okay, we have to demolish this building, we have to get rid of all the stuff that's here, and we're going to move that hospital somewhere else. And so that becomes a new piece of infrastructure in that instance. The reason I say all this is that the two most important concepts to me when we think about infrastructure financing are capital expenditures, which is the money you pay or you spend to build the thing that you want, and operational expenditures, which is the money you pay to maintain the things that you want. And again, if you take that whole life cycle cost accounting perspective, it means that you need to be aware of how those two pieces interact. An example that's really alive in my world, in the green buildings world, with the Vancouver Economic Commission, is the fact that many buildings that are built to, say, a passive house standard are less costly to maintain than a more cheaply built building initially that has much higher costs over time. And this may be because it has higher heating costs, it may be less adaptable over time, et cetera, et cetera. And this can vary, it depends where you're going, but having a holistic and a whole life cycle view means that we can more accurately, and I think in the context of those of us interested in sustainability and justice, we can more accurately and ideally more justly start to plan for our infrastructure. And part of the story here that's really important is the relative share of who builds infrastructure, right? It's one thing to say we need to build it, we need to pay for it, there's CapEx and OpEx, but there's many, many different types of infrastructure, as we're saying, and the people that pay for it and run it and operate it and build it, et cetera, vary greatly. And this is some old data from the US, but it just gives you a sense. There's certain types of infrastructure in North America, for example, and this is the US data specifically, healthcare, massively private sector, right? If this was in Canada, it would flip dramatically. Freight railroads in both the US and Canada are entirely private sector. There is no public freight option. And then you go over to public safety, that's police and like other security sort of investments, entirely public sector. We could quibble with that, but the general piece is there. But just to say that there's a spread, right, between these public and private sector actors. But the most important question, regardless of who you are, when you're going to build something is, do you already have the money to pay for it? And if the answer is yes, then there's actually a relatively small number of ways you probably did that. If you're both in the public or the private sector, you might have something called a capital reserve, which is just a bank account that you put aside for a specific purpose. Imagine a piggy bank that says new bridge taped to the front of it, where you're putting your pennies in or your billions of dollars so that one day you can build that thing that you want to do. A capital reserve could be capitalized or put money into it through general taxes, through special taxes, or maybe even a user charge. So if you run a transit system and you scalp a little bit off every ticket that you sell and say, okay, 5 cents from every ticket goes to the capital reserve account, and then someday we'll build another piece of infrastructure from that. In the private sector context, you might have a bank account that's populated by money from a stock sale or from selling one other asset, et cetera. Grants, they do exist for the public and private sector. They're more common for the public sector, especially for local governments, provinces. Get someone else to pay for it for you. Now, it's pretty rare that someone pays for the whole of the thing for you, but it does happen. Get someone else to do it for you. And then in the private sector world, equity, so the idea that you sell part of your company to someone else so that they will help pay for the project. You take that money and you plunk it into building the project. Which is not always common, but is one of the ways that things are done. If you didn't have the money to pay for this, then there are a few other options here. Both the public and the private sector use bonds and loans. The main difference between a bond and loan, which are just both ways of borrowing money from others, is that a bond is a tradable product. So it's like an IOU that you can hand to different actors. I see a question from Leah there. Leah, if it's okay, can you write down your question? I can come back to that. I'm tight on time here, so I want to make sure I get through everything so we can have a good conversation. Is that okay? hopefully, Leah. Okay, and Laura. I'm just going to keep going here, folks. Sorry. But whereas a loan, contrasting to a bond, is a one-to-one agreement. You're probably not going to trade your loan with someone unless that bank or whoever lent you that money is bought or sold or something like that. And the bonds and loans can be repaid through, again, general revenue or maybe revenue from the investment. In the public sector, there's more and more conversation now about something called value capture, which is that if we build something, the public builds infrastructure, and there are private beneficiaries around it. So I built a train next to your house is worth 150% more. Well, you, the homeowner, didn't do anything to earn that value, right? The public did. We gave you that value by building infrastructure next to your house. So the public might slice a little bit off your sale price when you get rid of your home someday, which is not a super common one, but it's definitely sort of in the public conversation. And then the public sector has a pretty unique way of building infrastructure that's very common these days. We call these public-private partnerships, or P3s. There's 1,000 different ways we could talk about these, so I'm not going to go super deep, but there are different kind of iterations of this, just broadly speaking, that basically amount to varying degrees of partnerships and ownership over a piece of infrastructure, where the private sector might design and build it, and then you operate it. They might design, build, operate, and maintain it. And you're gonna, you might let them sort of pay themselves from the fees or the investment, or so the revenue from that asset over time. And then once they've sort of paid themselves out, then you take it over. Or they might do everything, really. Like they might design, build, finance, operate, and maintain it. And you're sort of along for the ride on the basis of an agreement or something like that. Private sector doesn't really have that same kind of tool, but they may, they're beneficiaries in many ways of those kinds of partnerships. The thing that's, and so that's a very, very high level overview of how we can pay for infrastructure. And would love to dialogue deeper with you folks about that. But what I want to do as we start to round out this time is justify why, if we're talking about these relatively boring ways of paying for things, what actually can infrastructure do for us? Where does infrastructure underlie some really exciting potential for those of us who are interested in social, economic, environmental justice? And the question there is, what problems can infrastructure help solve? Emphasis on the help, right? There's no silver bullet for any of the societal problems we face, but infrastructure can be a part of the solutions to these major problems. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples. I probably don't need to tell any of you that climate action is a key place where infrastructure can play a really critical role. But I do want to tease out an idea here, which is that we often think about climate infrastructure in a pretty large scale way and with a very particular series of asset classes or types of infrastructure that we're focused on. So what does everybody think about as the infrastructure we need to build when we talk about climate action? Energy generation. We need to build more solar panels. We need cold fusion. We need hydrogen, all those kinds of energy, in most cases, production infrastructure. But that's not the whole story, right? There was a really great article that one of my favorite climate writers, David Roberts, did a few years back now that I just was looking back at. And he was talking about there was a really difficult and he felt wrong decision that was made in Massachusetts a number of years ago, where environmental activists said that they didn't want a nuclear power plant to be, I can't remember if it was built or restored in Massachusetts. And then they also, shortly thereafter, tried to stop and were successful in stopping the building of energy power lines, basically from Quebec to Massachusetts, so they could get some of Quebec's hydroelectricity. And what David Roberts said was they basically made a decision that the conservation of the forest was more important than the energy infrastructure that he argued they needed to build, which is interesting because the activists were saying, well, we can use solar power, we can use offshore wind, et cetera, but the cost and the connectivity of that infrastructure was really, really high. And there were some trade-offs they needed to make in terms of, okay, well, if we build only onshore wind and solar, it's going to cost us more because we need to build more, not because it's inherently a bad source of energy, but to get to the level of decarbonization we need to build X amount, and X, the cost of X is very high relative to building transmission infrastructure. So just running the power lines from Quebec. And so, it's not just a question of production, but also of distribution. in the energy case that's really critical and is often an underrated part of this. We don't recognize in the North American context that we actually have separate grids across North America. I think there's 5 in the US and there's four or 5 in Canada. And it's because our power lines in Canada run north-south. BC sells electricity to Washington State. Quebec sells electricity to New York and Massachusetts and so on. It doesn't run this way. And ditto for the US. There's these sort of power regions that don't necessarily cross over to each other. So when you hear discussions around like intermittent demand and intermittent production in renewable energy, the question of distribution, of transmitting power from A to B is a really core part of that. So climate action infrastructure, to finish that thought, is broad, right? It includes a huge number of things. And if you look at agriculture, forestry, and land use there, the second largest category of emissions, if we think about deforestation, crop burning, and livestock, there's infrastructure implicated in all those. And as I said at the start, if we think about green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, there's an important conversation about, are we losing some of the inherent value of nature, for example, when we put in or when we start to talk about green things as infrastructure, not just as nature. And I would love to have that conversation with you folks if you'd like to talk about that. But certainly there is a practical use for these institutions or these infrastructures that are natural in nature. And that's going to be part of the story of how we successfully combat climate changes. How are we making investments in some of those types of spaces? So climate action infrastructure, critical. The second one I think is really important here, and this is where I said I want to be thinking in as decolonial way as we can. We know that there is what's sometimes referred to as an Indigenous infrastructure gap in Canada, but that gap is really important to contextualize in my mind. So infrastructure is a Western word, right? But it refers to, as the definition suggests, the things that underpin the functioning of a society. And as we know, Indigenous peoples have been in Canada since time immemorial, and they were using the land. They were managing the land in ways that suited the society they lived in. You could, if you wanted, and I think in this case it doesn't seem inappropriate to refer to some of that as infrastructure. So in British Columbia here, there were certain Coast Salish peoples that did things that are called clam gardens. They pushed stones down into sort of areas that weren't quite deep enough to be considered tidal flats, or sorry, shallow enough to be considered tidal flats. And then they fill those in with dirt and sort of fill. And then they basically planted clams. They made little gardens of these. You could call that a sort of food infrastructure, if you like. And there are 100 other examples of Indigenous land management practices that you might consider part of infrastructure. The reason I say that is that when we talk about the infrastructure gap in Canada, that gap exists very purposefully in many ways. The development of the reserve system was about segregating Indigenous communities away from the infrastructure that the colonists wanted to build for themselves. And the system we inhabit today is a legacy of that, right? It's a legacy of the deliberate exclusion of a particular group of people. And so the building of infrastructure to those communities is not, it's not a case of like civilization has arrived, here we are. It's about, in many ways, the recompense or the restitution for a long-standing historical wrong. And whether that's boil water advisories, the building of schools, any number of other infrastructure types that are more sort of traditional to us, those are part of the story of reconciliation in many ways. And there are many, many conversations about how we, what are the types of infrastructure that need to be built, who's paying for them, et cetera, that are still part of that conversation. Finally, poverty and development. Infrastructure is its own SDG, but it's implicated in almost all of the SDGs in some way, shape, or form, especially if you take a very broad and holistic view of what infrastructure looks like. And there's not much more to say in this other than if we do not have good infrastructure, it will make the achievement of the SDGs very, very difficult. And again, especially if we're taking a kind of decolonial perspective on infrastructure, arguably it becomes even more important if we're thinking about the social and ecological functions that infrastructure can serve vis-a-vis each of these SDGs. So let's talk about social justice and infrastructure here as we sort of wind down. I sort of initially pitched this session to, well, I should say, Brianna and the Leading Change team were kind enough to ask me to do this session. But when we started talking about it, I said right away that I think infrastructure is actually really cool. And the reason I think it's cool is right in the definition. It is the thing that is underneath our society. It's the stuff that we don't pay much attention to. If we decided to pay attention to it, what kind of transformative change might we, what kind of transformative change might be possible as a result of that? And I think actually there's a lot. So I started to ask myself some questions that I think are really important when we're thinking about how we mesh together the justice objectives we have, ecological, racial, social, economic, in our thinking about sustainable infrastructure finance. And these are kind of the broad questions that I think if you were in a position to influence how infrastructure was going to be built, or you're trying to advance a specific agenda or a vision of a better type of infrastructure or a better way of building infrastructure, then these would be some of the questions that would be really important to ask. Who decides what we build? Infrastructure, as I said before, is a very big category. It involves all levels of government, it involves all levels of society, and it involves public, private, nonprofit, charitable, faith-based, natural, and other organizations. So the question of who builds and who has a say in who builds is absolutely important. The obvious example, I think, in the Canadian context is the commitment to free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous peoples when it comes to various types of infrastructure or development that occur, particularly in their like legally established territories. But there's also, other questions, like we have a national government that didn't campaign on, for example, buying an oil and gas pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia. They decided that that was infrastructure that they wanted to build. What was the say that we all had in that construction? It was relatively minimal, some would argue. And there's other cases where there's infrastructure that's built that's, very positive and community-led. And I think those are some of the most exciting ones. But there's a tension there, right? Because often the bigger the infrastructure, the less say we all have in how it's built. The next, and probably one of the most critical questions, is who pays for it? Is it us? Is it society? Is the infrastructure paid for by a very specific group of people, maybe who are localized because they benefit from it? Is the infrastructure built for a particular group of people who don't have the capacity to pay, and yet we feel that they are owed this kind of infrastructure and that that's important, so we're just going to build it anyway? And maybe the we is society at large who pay for something that helps a very specific group of people because morally or even practically we think that's important. The who pays has a number of dimensions that are really important. And I think as specific as we can get about who pays, the more sort of rich a conversation we can have about the potential positive justice implications of a given project. The how we pay is also critical. And this goes back to the point I was making about capital, or the different types of infrastructure financing methods. If we think about capital reserves, there's a moral argument that's sometimes made in the kind of finance community that the idea of only ever saving your pennies to pay for something, we want to keep taxes low. We don't want to borrow any money. So we're going to set aside 1% of general revenue every year so that we can build hospitals, schools, playgrounds, highways, trains, power plants. There's a case that could be made that I'm quite sympathetic to, that deciding to only pay with this very limited amount of money you collect today is a short shrifting of future generations. And especially as governments have the capacity to borrow large amounts of money, that becomes a really, really important sort of moral stance to take. It's like, how do we pay for it? Do we borrow money and we say, yes, we need to pay this back over time, and there's implications for that, but also we need to build this now and we can't wait. So we think that the moral trade-off is robust enough that we want to build it today, and so we're going to borrow money to pay for that. I think that's a really crucial distinction, because if you're, as an individual, yes, maybe you don't want to take on a whole bunch of debt, but governments and corporations and other entities, they have a different kind of capacity, and it's important to recognize that difference. Who profits? This is a fascinating question. And it's fascinating in large part because the types of profiting that occur in infrastructure can be so varied. If it's a question of user fees and we need to build something really critical, we want to pay for it, and we're going to just charge people a ticket price as a way to recoup that, and someone else gets that money, there's moral implications there, right? But also the who can be quite mysterious at times. In the real estate world, for example, we talk about the speculation and these like massive developers coming in. One of the things that's important to recognize in Canada is that many of the largest developers in the country, and almost all of them, are owned by pension plans. So who profits? in a pension plan context? The people who are in that pension plan. If the Canada pension plan invests in $70 billion in Canadian real estate, who's benefiting? Is that Canadians? Yes and no, right? So those uncovering those nuances of who profits are really critical. And then how do they profit? Again, this question of user fees and excuse me, this question of user fees versus maybe debt that's put on the on wealthier folks. If someone is just making a buck from building infrastructure and they're not maintaining it well, or they're not held to a certain standard, that question of profit can become very morally fraught. And then finally, these kind of last three questions, and I'm realizing I'm running out of time here. These last questions are really relevant in the context of that operational planning, right? Do we have a budget set aside in our general revenue to maintain something at a very high quality? Or are we just building something and saying, oh, we'll figure out how we'll pay for the upkeep later on? That's a very dangerous way of thinking. And in many cases, it leads to the failure of the infrastructure that's really, really important. The final question is really, how do we leverage the infrastructure that we build? One of the things that I feel really dedicated to is that the benefits of infrastructure should build on themselves over time. So if we invest in a transportation system that's really clear and robust, and maybe it's saving us money. For example, you build bike lanes, it's proven that you can save money in healthcare costs. How is that money flowing between different systems? Can we build on it so that we save more money for society over time, or we generate more wealth and prosperity for everyone at the same time? That question of leverage is really critical. I'm running out of time here, so I'm not gonna belabor this one at all, but I just wanted to put this on people's agenda, or on your radars. There's a great bit of work that's been done in the UK in a city called Preston, which is their ability to link together the various functions of their local economy, so that when they build infrastructure, the local government in the center there, they're spending on the development of particular things the community needs. Maybe they need to build a public energy utility. That, as you can see, if you go to the left, their public energy utility provides affordable, sustainable power that benefits the community residents. But maybe there's also like a little bit of cash that comes from that. Okay, where does it go to? Well, maybe it goes to the public pension fund. The profit of that is then reinvested. Who builds that infrastructure? Well, in Preston, they actually have a system of building worker-owned cooperatives, so that the people that build infrastructure are also the people that use it in the community. And so there's a cyclicality of money that flows through. There's 1,000 hours of talk we could have about this model in particular, but I just want to suggest that the linkage of building, operating, maintaining, financing, and benefiting from, we can draw a relatively straight line of causality and connection between those if we're thoughtful. So the conclusion here, I'm going to leave you with just 3 takeaways as we kind of close out here. The first is that infrastructure is everywhere. If you really take that broad view, everything from a water fountain to a water reservoir to the hangar for your national military's fighter jets to the big hydroelectric dam, every one of those is an instance of infrastructure. And taking that kind of eye means that we can, in some ways, legitimate things that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to, like childcare, maybe. But also that when we're talking about infrastructure, we have to recognize the negative externalities and the challenges that it brings with it as well. The second piece is that infrastructure can last for ages, can last forever in some cases. There's Indian water reservoirs, for example, that are centuries, in some cases millennia old, that are still used to this day. If we build it well, it can last a long time and benefit us for a long time. But it also means we need to have an eye to longevity. That's that whole life cycle cost approach, right? And finally, this is a picture of the Senac development here in Vancouver. That's one of the largest Indigenous land development project in history, building a bunch of purpose-built rental. If you transform infrastructure, if you transform who pays, who benefits, how it's built, you can transform the world, because it does underpin the world. And I think that's one of the most exciting things to kind of dwell on as we look at this age of climate action, of social justice, is the things underneath us can be part of the better world that we want to build. And actually getting access to them and being part of that transformation is not as distant as we might think. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. That was super fun, and a lot of fantastic information for us to digest and think about. So we're going to transition to some questions for the remaining part of this hour. We've got our first question from CC, and I want to encourage everybody to type their questions in the chat so that we can get to them in the order that they're asked. So CC asks, quote, "Hi everyone, this was a fabulous overview, George. Super engaging, and I'm looking forward to reviewing the recorded materials. My question, it's very easy to access and learn about the US electricity markets, and there's an example of a website that I'd encourage everybody to check out. And CC says, I've checked electricity.ca, IESO, and AESO, but there isn't a comparable overview or a map that comments on the way generation is organized across Canada. Do you have any recommendations?"
Yeah, there's a great question. And yes, it speaks to like the relative fragmentation of Canadian governance systems that like even though power is generally regulated at a more local level than national, you can still find that info in the States and you can't find it here. There's a great academic actually who's very active on Twitter. His name's Blake Schaefer, and I'll throw a link to his details in the chat here. He does a lot of work on Canadian power generation. He would know, first of all, some of these questions. He also shares a lot of information about it. So I highly recommend checking out some of his info. He's got great stats and research he does. I would also suggest the Canadian Electricity Association. They are the sort of industry group, if you like, of the major electricity producers throughout Canada. They might have some maps and other resources there that could start to track that. Canada is a very funny one because of these highly fragmented regional power markets we have. Like BC and Alberta are always talked about sharing power, but it's a complicated, very fraught story. So unfortunately, I don't have any great info for you there, but I think maybe the other place I would look at is Natural Resources Canada. I think they would have a pretty strong regulatory role where interprovincial power generation is concerned. So I would also look there as well. I hope that's helpful, Cece.
Well, I've got a question while we're waiting for some more, perhaps. Oh, we've got one from Brianna, so I'll just ask that one quickly first. I love the perspective you've brought around expanding our definition of infrastructure to consider both social and ecological infrastructure. You mentioned a couple pros and cons of this approach. Pros being the legitimization of social and ecological infrastructure. Cons, as you mentioned, quote, "Are we losing the inherent value of nature when we start talking of infrastructure?" End quote. Can you talk more about some examples of this expanded view of infrastructure and some of the pros and cons?
Yeah, great question, Brianna. And like I said, it's very fraught, right? There is, I think, let's take nature-based solutions and sort of green infrastructure as the first example. So if we take an entirely instrumental view of nature, instrumental meaning that it is an instrument of the human needs and desires that we have, and not something that has value in and of itself. It's only valuable insofar as it benefits us directly. There are dangers to that. There are dangers in the sense that, if you're someone who cares about animal welfare, for example, the idea that primates exist for us, are a resource for us to draw on and do medical testing or cosmetic testing on, that's something for many people that is considered a too much of an instrumental view, of a resource-based view of what those other beings, quite frankly, are and what kind of value and relationship they have with us. If we think about if we look at nature through the lens of its use, it's very easy to get into a situation where you start creating, in the finance world, we talk about fungibility, right? Like the idea that if you have cash, you can move that around and trade. Homer Simpson can be exchanged for cash can be exchanged for exchange for goods and services, right? Duh. If you start to see infrastructure, like everything is infrastructure, and a tree produces, this sort of research shows, a tree produces on average in North America something like $100,000 in what we call ecological services. So it's a piece of infrastructure, it cleans the air, it manages stormwater, it does a bunch of things for us that are good. If we say it produces $100,000 in services for us every year, then we can use, it's not too many steps down the road to say, well, if we had $100,000 a year to spend on something else, we could cut this tree down and we could replace it. And the replacement value starts to create this transferability between infrastructure types. Now, sometimes that can be a really good thing because, for example, there's a story that's often told about New York's water system where they would have had to spend on the order of billions of dollars to build an upstream water treatment plant that would treat the water going into New York City. They looked at the cost of that plant and said, yikes, that is a lot of money to spend. We do have an existing natural water system here, but there are people upstream who are polluting it. There's challenges in how the water is managed across this whole basis. What if we invested in the existing natural infrastructure and protected it so that we continue to benefit from it and we didn't have to build a huge water treatment plant? Great, you've used that sort of, the fungibility or the replacement value of that infrastructure to justify, in my view, it's a very smart choice. But you could easily look to do that in a way that you'd say, well, we've got the money to replace it. Sure, get rid of it, right? And you ignore then the inherent value, the spiritual value, the cultural value of a given piece of nature. And I think as we enter into an era where carbon markets are very likely to be a huge part of how we deal with climate change, the idea that a forest only exists and has value to us insofar as it sequesters enough carbon. What about the indigenous people that live next to that forest in Brazil, let's say? What about the local value of the shade that it provides that we in the global north don't benefit from? That may be part of like a local climate zone's cooling infrastructure, if you like, and we don't benefit from that. So we don't include that in the cost. We only get the sequestration value, and so we only value it at that basis. The nature of valuation is so subjective that it can be very easy to put yourself in a position where you have, on received wisdom, you've made a valuation of something that maybe means something very, very different to someone else. I'd say the other kind of, I'm talking about cons now, right? Because I think it's important to say we need to have this broad approach. I do agree with that. But some of the other cons might be that we start to take maybe a little bit too generous a view of who provides important infrastructure services and like how fixed, I guess, the model that they provide is. So let's take telecommunications in Canada. The telecommunications infrastructure that we exist within is, it's okay. It's not great by global standards. It's also not the worst. The people that run it, i.e. the big telecommunications firms in Canada, have a very specific way that they want to operate our telecommunications infrastructure, which is that Canadians pay on average some of the highest prices for telecom services in the world. Now, just because they run what is inarguably critical infrastructure, does that mean that their position in the infrastructure is somehow sacrosanct, that we can never ever touch the way that that infrastructure is built? I would argue no. So when we talk about infrastructure, when we use the language of infrastructure to talk about something that's societally important, there can be moments when that starts to sound like, oh, but that's just important and we can't change that. It's so critical, right? You can say that something's important and also say that it's not being done in the best way. And that kind of criticism can be difficult when you get into the infrastructure framing of an issue. And there's people that do it in different ways. The Supreme Court in the United States, Justice Clarence Thomas, is someone I have almost never agreed with my entire life, recently said that social media could be run and should be run as a utility, public utility, which would mean that there would be very different rules because it's infrastructure about how we would maintain our social media spaces. That's a good example of the sort of infrastructuralization, if you like, maybe leading to potentially some positive outcomes. So I've rambled a lot there, but I think there's, it's a very rich and difficult way to slice it. And there's no right answer, right? It's like being aware of the tripwires for mobilizing that infrastructure language.
Wow, so much to digest with that response. That was a fantastic question, Brianna. Thank you. So I've got a question about how important it is for certain forms of infrastructure to be able to pay for itself. Because that's one argument that we often hear about, right? Like this, we can't invest in this because it has no way to pay for itself. Often used in cases of things like transit. But then comparing that to things, like maintaining roads and things like that, especially in Canada where we have this urban sprawl issue. So yeah, I'd just like to get some of your thoughts on that.
Love that question. And it goes back to the point I was making about CapEx and OpEx, right? So, and some of the sort of social justice questions I was kind of framing a minute ago. So the history of suburbanization is a really, really interesting story of infrastructure. We spent, in today's dollar values, trillions of dollars in North America in the years immediately after World War II. We built, in the United States and Canada, we built an interstate, interprovincial highway system. We built brand new transportation infrastructure in our cities. We built electricity. And then we built on the order of hundreds of thousands and millions of homes, each of which was connected to sewer systems, to sidewalks, to roads, to lighting, all that, right? We built that in a burst. We did not build that with a long-term plan of how we were going to maintain that infrastructure. And what's happening now is that there are many suburban communities that are older that are facing declining infrastructure. The lifespan of our, for example, in the city of Vancouver, our unseparated sewer and water lines is complete. Like they are at the end of their life. And so we now have to go through an incredibly expensive process of replacing various elements of our water infrastructure in the city. And we never planned to pay for that 70 years ago. And now the chickens have come home to roost. Now, that's not to say that every piece of infrastructure needs to be so like perfectly crafted and the financing needs to be, ready in perpetuity. But to have an eye that like, okay, at some point we're going to need to fix this is a really important element of good infrastructure planning. And in the suburban world, what's really tricky is that we need to pay for the replacement now of all these different infrastructures, roads, sidewalks, bridges, sewers, power, whatever. And the way that we pay for that right now is through property taxes at the local level. And there are not enough property taxes in this country, even with our really inflated land values, for us to pay for the replacement. And the challenge is that there's an insufficient tax base really to cover all of the various infrastructure costs that are out there and in the local government world. So we're really going to struggle to pay for the replacement of that without some sort of massive injection of cash. And if we sort of zoom out from the perspective of like, how do we pay for water or how do we pay for roads, and think about like, how do we pay for cities, like as a higher level category, how do we pay for cities? The conclusion you would draw, as I have, is that we don't pay for cities right now, and we are not going to, and that we need to radically restructure the way we pay for all of the urban infrastructure that exists so that we can know that we're going to have stable stuff in the long term. And what's in, so, and that's for the existing infrastructure that we already have in our cities. If you are, I'm not going to pick on anybody, but if you're a community in Canada that's building lots of suburban sprawl, you are potentially putting yourself almost certainly in a position where you're going to have some massive costs that are going to catch up with you in a few decades. And because we know it's already happening in places that are older. So if you are building kind of endlessly outwards at a very low density where the tax base is small, guess what? You're going to be stuck with a bill in future generations that you probably don't have a plan to pay for. So even though the idea that, it's a relatively small amount of money, maybe we even have the money to pay for the initial injection of the maintenance, but without a strong capital budgeting mindset that extends over a long period of time, it can catch up with you. So I think it's a really important question that we're just starting to grapple with. And quite frankly, like our cities are entering a period of fiscal crisis in the next decade or so as all those old infrastructure costs come home to roost, because we need to pay for the replacement. And guess what? We need to spend hundreds of billions of dollars building new bus stops, new bike lanes, new affordable housing, new power generation, better climate adaptation infrastructure, yada, yada, yada. So the maintaining the old and building the new at the same time, there's not enough money that cities have access right now to do that. And I worry greatly about what that'll mean for them.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. It's definitely something that's been on my mind as well, especially living in this country and comparing it to, the more denser sort of cities that we have in other parts of the world as well. We've got a few minutes left, so maybe time for one more question. Just leaving it open.
I can be really fast too if you guys want to squeak a few extra ones in.
Cool.
Not known for my brevity, but.
We've got just one more from Brianna here. This conversation reminds me of accountability. As you mentioned, the larger the project, often the lesser the input and accountability. What is the infrastructure in place to increase the accountability of public actors to society in making these massive decisions? And where are the levers and intervention points?
Mm. So, there's two questions there, right? The first answer is that there are not that many. It's that you participate with your elected officials and you say, I want you to get elected so that you will build these things of infrastructure that are important to me. I think the more, and in some ways, it's a very difficult conversation to make more democratic, because if you want to really get into the weeds of it, like, does the average person have the knowledge and insight to comment on whether we should build wide gauge or medium gauge intercity railways? I am a professional urban planner and I barely have enough knowledge to like meaningfully contribute to that conversation. I think the best things we can do about our, like when we're talking to our elected officials and our governments about these kinds of infrastructure decisions, the things that we need to demand first and foremost, in my view, are trade-offs. Don't tell me you're going to build something that's going to fix all of my problems. Tell me that we've got a few things that we can build, and here is a genuine and holistic and critical view of the trade-offs between those different things. Do we build a bridge or do we build a tunnel? Do we build a train or do we build a highway? There are trade-offs inherent in both of those, and nothing is perfect, right? There is no silver bullet to any social problem. But if we can be transparent about those trade-offs, then that's a really core part. To me, the most interesting lever and intervention point is, and this kind of is in the spirit of infrastructure itself, right? The things that underlie, that are underneath. As a professional planner, although I'm not a registered planner technically, the interesting thing to me, my observation in that world is like professional practice, like the organizations that build this stuff, whether that's engineers, urban planners, architects, other types of designers, et cetera, shaping their professional practice and saying, hey, if you're involved in the building of something, yes, I realize that like, the public engagement for a bridge is never going to get down to the level of like, how many pillars should it have? Or, what kind of load bearing strength does it need? That's probably not a meaningful public engagement question. But if we can actually intervene before we even build infrastructure and say, we want all engineers in Canada or all planners in Canada to build infrastructure that recognizes the existential challenge of climate change, the necessity morally and legally of achieving reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. It recognizes environmental racism, that communities of colors have historically been the most negatively impacted by the building of infrastructure. If we start to build those sort of necessities into the practice of all these professions, politicians or the sort of professional side as well, then we can actually, we've swam upstream from the individual instances of building infrastructure. We've gone way up further, where actually we probably have a lot more power and levers to pull than just, I don't want this bridge to get built, which is often, sadly, when the public is engaged most thoroughly. So that's where I get most excited about leverage points, is like, how do we swim up the chain of decision making to a point where individuals can actually have a conversation. It's not just the government and the public who are talking together.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, George. That brings us to the end of our hour.